Cold War Crisis in Asia Research. Read it Sino Soviet War 1969, Border Conflict, Andy, T, and Binko. So, who and what groups were impacted? The groups that were impacted are the Chinese Communist Party and Mao Zedong, and the Communist Party of Soviet Union and Nikita Khrushchev. Lastly, U.S. President Richard Nixon's who visited China in 1972. What actually occurred? During the Cold War in 1949, China converted to communist and were allied along Soviet as the biggest communist country. However, by the late 1950s, ideological differences had emerged between two countries, and China accused the Soviet Union of betraying Marxism as well as Stalinism. This was all done due to Khrushchev's control over the Soviet Union, where each country began to pursue its own foreign policy, which included different attitude and approach towards non-communist countries such as the United States, which eventually led to the Sino-Soviet border conflict war in 1969.
Sino-Soviet War took place in 1969. First of all, the main locations was that it was in parts of China in Xinjiang province, and second of all, it involved the Soviet Union. And the main battles were fought along the Usuri River, which was where the territory where both sides were trying to reclaim. And a significant location was the Zhenbao Island, which was a direct firing between China and USSR, and where the war mainly took place. Next up, we have why did this event happen and occur? Based off 3 key points. The first key point is on the definition of communism, which is Mao Zedong's communist ideology conflicted directly with Khrushchev's ideology, and Mao tried to promote a heroistic figure of himself in China, while on the other side, Khrushchev tried to promote a fair society within Soviet Union after he became the leader of Soviet Union after Joseph Stalin went off. And Mao stood for a peasants' and agricultural workers' revolution, and he proved that his communism and revolution was better than Russia's by making the peasants' revolution a successful revolution. And the second key point is over the view towards the West. Mao's aggressive attitude towards the Westerners was caused due to the aftercause of Opium War and the previous Western invasions during the Qing Dynasty, which then kept China to hold an aggressive and negative perspective towards Westerners. And Mao disagrees with Soviet Union's perspective of peaceful coexistence between the communist countries and the capitalist countries, which is the Western and Eastern parts of the world. And the last key point is over prestige, which is that China believes they own the superior system and the better version of communism compared to Khrushchev's and Soviet Union's communist. And also, Mao believes that China should be part of the major forces of the world alongside with America and USSR because they were excluded during the Cold War. And the Cold War took place mainly between America, the main forces of the world, America and USSR. Famous quote here said by Mao Zedong was that socialism must be developed in China, and the route towards such an end is a democratic revolution, which will enable socialist and communist consolidation over a length of time. It is also important to unite with the middle peasants and educate them on the failings of capitalism.
When did this happen? March 2nd, Chinese soldiers went across the Usuri River and set up camp in Soviet territory, or known as the island of Damansky. While the Soviet warned the Chinese to stay away from the island, but the Chinese refused. In March 15th of 1969, Soviet deployed troops for a surprise attack as retaliation against the Chinese. 4 days later, in March 19th, 1969, China eventually retreated from the island after days of fighting with casualties on both sides. And in March 27, China wanted to negotiate to resolve the border issues. But in May 16th, Soviet refuses to negotiate terms with China over the disputed territory because they refused to come to China's demands. And finally, in August, China and Soviet agreed to talk in Beijing in hoping of resolving the border disputes. But unfortunately, they couldn't come to terms. And finally, in September 11, 1969, China and Soviet Union signed a ceasefire agreement to end border clashes.
And the first perspective we have was that Mao Zedong said that the Soviet Union is a social imperialist state. We cannot expect any support from them. And it was made in a speech presented to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, which is the CCP, June 14, 1963. And this quote was by Mao Zedong during the Sino-Soviet conflict, and Mao Zedong was the leader of China. And his perspective showed dissatisfaction and a rise of conflict towards the Soviet Union, which he believed abandoned the Marxist-Leninist principles under the new leadership of Nikita Khrushchev instead of Joseph Stalin. And this quote was presented on June 14, 1963 at the second session of 8th Central Communist Committee of the CCP. And lastly, Mao believed that the Soviet Union was in pursuit of their own imperialist target instead of the promotion of communist influence within Asia and making sure that communist countries would become a major force in the world compared to the capitalist countries in the western parts of the world. So he drew his lines with Khrushchev through his speech and made it clear that China was going against Soviet Union and they disagreed.
Second's perspective. If we take China into account, we will have a far better chance of winning the Cold War than if we have to fight the Soviet Union alone. This is President Richard Nixon, a memorandum to National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger on July 1st of 1969. He said this because of his perspective on the Sino-Soviet War is to be on China's side, as at the time, China was seen as a potential ally due to the relationship of China and Soviet deteriorating over time, and the U.S. is in the Cold War against the Soviet. President Nixon's goal, his bigger goal was the greater interest of the United States and winning the Cold War. In order to do that, he has to try to be on China's side. President Nixon also hoped that by having China as an ally, it could weaken the Soviets' position to negotiate terms and increase U.S.'s leverage during negotiations to end the Cold War.
No perspective. The Sino-Soviet split during the 1961 to 1989 was a tense period in the Cold War, where there was an ongoing tension between the two communist countries, China and Soviet Union. We think that this is a very remarkable event in the history because it shows that even two countries that's supposed to be on the same team could still have conflict together. Many aspects of the history really influence this opinion because learning about Cold War, we always thought that China and Soviet Union were allies, since in many armed races, such as the proxy war, they seem to be on the same side. Learning about this conflict really fascinates me because it shows that some details could be missed and it leads to different perspectives towards the war.